Hi everyone, Patrick here with a quick introduction before we get into the latest in our interview series. This time I'm talking to Max Brault, who recently came out with his book, The Race to the Starting Line. So for those of you who may not be aware of it, Max is a leader in accessibility and disability advocacy with experience throughout the last decades in both public service and private consulting, where he's played key roles in shaping all kinds of accessibility policies across Canada, including the main topic of our episode, the recent Accessible Canada Act, right, which was passed in 2019 and that I think more people should know about because it's really interesting as a document and as this piece of active legislation. So I think listeners will get a lot out of this, and I highly recommend that people check out the book. There will be links to where you can find it in the description, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
Okay, so I'm here today with Max Brault, and we're here to talk about your recent book, The Race to the Starting Line. So first of all, Max, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me as a guest.
And just for listeners who may not be familiar with either your work or the text itself, would you mind giving listeners a bit of context as to what The Race to the Starting Line is about and where you're coming from with what you're presenting here?
Right. So what people need to understand right from the start, I'm a 55-year-old man, and I've spent, I would say, the better half of my life being an advocate for people with disabilities. I learned at a very young age that I had some pretty um, very interesting path to a career path and a trajectory that I can make a lot of changes and benefits for people with disabilities.
Mhm.
So I've been doing, I guess you could say, I've been saying 35 years, but I should be saying almost 40 years. I've been advocating for people with disabilities in the workplace and making sure that individuals with disability know their rights.
Right.
And one of the reasons why I wrote this book, and it's one of the primary reasons, is that because I deal with the rights movement a lot, I know my rights. And so when anybody deals with me, they know you got to be careful with Max because he knows the rights, and you got to be really careful with dealing with me in certain degree because I will, be like anybody else. Wait a sec, that's wrong, and then I go and like a bulldog fight like that. Um, but a common everyday individual who doesn't play in this foray, be it human rights, legal rights, law, whatever, they don't know this stuff, right? And they hear the common vernacular of what they see on TV and the radio, what they think their rights are. But the reality is, every individual who's walking in Canada doesn't know their rights, in my opinion, right? And I think the one thing, Patrick, and I'm going to say this as it comes across as harsh, but it's a reality. The one thing, if you claim yourself to be a free citizen, like a person who's free and can choose to make decisions, do that, is a person who truly knows their rights.
Yeah.
If you don't know your rights, then you're not free, if you get where I'm coming from,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
That's who I am.
Awesome. Thank you. And one of the things to come back to the text that I thought was so striking is right in your introduction. You mentioned early on that you were rather frustrated, right, with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right, and how vague it was specifically related to disability rights. And there was a really striking moment where you mentioned that your father told you, well, that's your job to actually figure out those vaguenesses, like those vagaries. Yeah, vagaries would be a better term here. Um, and I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more on how that moment kind of shaped your sense of responsibility, drive for systemic change in the way that you're talking about just now.
Yeah, and you bring up a really, really good point. I was a young guy. Like I was like in my mid 20s, and like in your 20s, you got I'm sorry if you're listening in your 20s, but you got a certain kind of scope of what you think life is, right? I think by the time you hit 30, you have a better idea of what life really is. But
Right.
um, one of the things that moment struck is that I can't expect people to fix or provide answers and do it for me. Like it's all me. Like it's like I've always wanted to be a cook. The
Mhm.
thing I like about cooks or chefs is when they make something, and they give it to somebody to eat it, and the person doesn't like it,
Yeah.
they go back and go, shit, I made a bad recipe, and they go back and change the recipe, right? If you make bad decisions, there is a human characteristic that we blame everything around us in the process in
Yeah.
making that decision, that we blame that instead of blaming ourselves. And I think that in order to fix something, we need to take ownership for our own decisions, our own mistakes,
Yeah.
right? And that's what I learned from that.
That's really interesting. Um, and I had one last question before we get into some of the intricacies of the main focus of your book, which is, of course, the Accessible Canada Act. Um, and again, in the introduction of the book, you mention that you did make somewhat of a career shift, right? You started off in what you call a rewarding public service career, but then shifted towards more of a consultant, private sector position, right?
Yeah.
And I'm curious, just to give a little bit of context for listeners, why you decided to make that shift, right? What led you from more public service to private, and what are the differences for you there as far as what you can actually achieve?
Well, it's also part of. Have you ever heard of that saying and I think it's one of the Beatles who says, in order to become successful in something you do, you
Mm.
need to be doing it for 10,000 hours, or
Right.
you,
Yeah.
you need to do it on and on and on and on and on, and then eventually you get sick of it and you just do. I looked at my public service career as my 10,000 hours of that, right? I
Yeah.
learned how to be a better communicator. I
Mm.
learned how to, wow, my story is not getting through. How do I change my story to get through? Um, and also I learned how to get stuff done,
Yeah.
right? Like it sounds really bizarre, but the federal public service, a lot of people give it a lot of, it's bad for this, it's bad for this, but you know what it's really good for? It's really good for a human being to really learn their skill set and not worry about losing their job trying to do it.
Yeah.
And I'm being sarcastic when I say it, but it's true, right? Because I made a lot of mistakes during
Sure.
those years, right? And I didn't get walked out of the door. If I was in the private sector, I don't think I would have had that latitude,
Yeah. I see
right?
exactly what you mean. Yeah.
And so when I joined BDO, which was my first corporate, I joined it with one idea that I've been a federal public servant for 21 years. I didn't know how to be a consultant. So I needed to be honest with you, go and cut my my jib on how to be a consultant. So I saw it as my university years. So I spent 4.5 years working with BDO, perfecting what I now call the Max Bro experience, which is basically who I am, what I am, but it's a combination of the federal public service experience with consulting, with the private sector, and then coming up with what I now in my 50s now see as what I really am, if that makes any sense,
Yeah,
right?
for sure. Yeah, definitely. I like that analogy very much. Like form training, university years, and then going forward. Yeah, very good. Yeah.
Yeah. And I gotta tell you, in the private sector, there
Mhm.
is not a lot of leeway for mistakes, dude,
That's true. That's true.
right?
Yeah.
Um, and I learned that really quickly. And I learned, I gotta hit home runs. Here's something else I will say. I was doing something that is now, I would say, more commonplace, but I was one of the first out of the gate to do this. And what I mean by this is that when I joined BDO, no other consulting firm had a business line just on accessibility. They call it equity, they call it this, but what they were really doing is a lot of paper stuff. But there was no actual doing the work, like going in there, working with organizations and making the changes. They would just say, "Well, here's our paper, read our paper, and take some of the ideas from that. Oh, and give us 20,000 for writing the paper." We would want to go in and do the work. So, but I had brought one philosophy, my friend. I did this saying, hire, if you're going to work for people with disabilities, if you're going to change things for people with disabilities, hire people with disabilities, right? You hear this a lot from our Indigenous brothers and sisters in Canada who say, don't talk about us without us being at the table and being part of the process of changing this. And they've been saying this for decades, and they're right. The only people who know what an Indigenous person wants is an Indigenous person. The only people who really understand the disability equation, if you want me to call it that way, is a person with a disability. And so I started bringing that, you're going to do it right. Hire disabled people to do it. So now you see a lot of consulting firms hiring disabled people because I showed them a way to do this. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud there's a lot of people who don't even know it, but because of what I started 8, 9 years ago, they now got a job in the private sector working on behalf of people with disabilities and making money, my friend.
Yeah.
Can
Absolutely.
you think of a better, resolution to that?
No, absolutely. I really think it's an important point to emphasize, right? That's something I've gotten frustrated in different contexts about of these declarations, right? That you raise of, well, we acknowledge certain things or we should do certain things, but then never actually putting it into practice. And that's one of the things that really drew me to your book when it was first recommended to me was it seemed to be putting into practice what a lot of people were just leaving on paper, right? And I really want to emphasize that it's really a great idea. Yeah, but
Yeah.
necessary. Not it's not a great idea. It's a necessary idea, I should say.
No, but yeah, it really comes down to a two-word term,
Yeah.
lived experience, right? And be it gay, be it indigenous, be it racialized, be it
Mhm.
wherever community you come from, right? You got to go to that community and say, hey, what are we not picking up? So you
Yeah.
don't have 20 Trumps sitting in the room going, we know what needs to be done. We're going to dictate what needs to be done and then force feed us that formula.
Mhm.
That doesn't work. We've been living that for a long time,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I guess that's as good of a segue as any to actually bring us into one of the central elements, right, of the race to the starting line, which is the Accessible Canada Act, right, or ACA. We'll also be referring to it as that in this conversation. Um, but I'll come back to the simple question. Do you mind explaining to listeners what exactly the Accessible Canada Act is, and to people who might be curious, right, why we needed a separate act for something like accessibility, right? Why doesn't it fit into something like the Charter of Rights?
Right. We as Canada, as much as I like to think that Canadians have a different way of looking at social context compared to our American or our various European brothers and sisters. I honestly think that being Canadian actually means being more open to other ideas that you are not normally um, aware of until you become aware of them, right? But there is a systemic problem in our society, and that is as a human being, we get to turn around and go, yeah, what the people with disabilities and the indigenous folks and the gay and lesbian folks are saying are right. they're being ostracized and run out of places because we don't understand what they're trying to say to us. 90% of the world we can go into and we can say, like in my case, I'm in an electric wheelchair, right? I can go, like, it actually happened to me last night. I was outside of a restaurant, and the restaurant had about, I would say, a foot step to get into the restaurant. And we didn't know when we went there. And they're like, well, we'll lift you up in the wheelchair and let you in. Now, the solution, Patrick, is for my whole family to eat with me. I could have said yes, right? And I said no.
Yeah.
I said, you're not getting a dime from me and my family because you do not open up your restaurant for my business, if that makes sense, right? And you lied to me because you told me your restaurant was accessible. Well, yeah, because we could pick you up and lift you up this stuff. That's not accessibility, right? And so what I'm trying to get at here, right, is that the in certain circumstances, we need to legislate, we need to force corporations and businesses to ensure that the offerings that they offer, be it whatever service they offer, include accessibility. Because time and time again, if we don't include it into the process, it becomes a retro process. And God knows how expensive God retro processes are. And you understand where I'm coming from, right? And so the yes, and my rights appear to because it's in a charter. Yeah, but it doesn't explain to corporations and businesses and people what that means. You understand where I'm coming from? Because corporations are not human beings.
Mhm.
And this is something like you got to. Okay, I'm gonna give a business class here real quick, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
The number one rule is a business exists for its primary mandate to make money,
Mhm.
right? And so the identity of this business is not about adhering to human rights. It's not here to make sure you're happy. The only thing it wants you to know, are you happy you bought the product? Will you buy more? That's the only thing that motivates it to change where it goes.
Yeah,
So unless the product is constantly changing to ensure that you're purchasing it, you will never incorporate certain changes.
yeah.
And so to ensure banks have lower counters, to ensure hospitals of all places have lower counters, to ensure that local transportations incorporate people with disabilities to get to some of the all the corners of the city. And remember, they are some of the most impoverished people in our society.
Yep.
And transportation should be to help impoverished people get to work. You need legislation to exist.
Right.
And you need to explain the what, if that
Mhm.
makes sense.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
at the basic minimum level, like you don't want them to, turn around and say, you need to widen the doors. No,
Mhm.
you just need to say your place needs to be fully accessible. Figure it out, folks.
Absolutely.
Am I making sense?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I'm just wanting a point of elaboration here that came to mind because you mentioned specifically businesses and companies, right? As requiring, yeah, as needing to put into place these accessible, or being more accessible, I should say.
Right.
And I'm curious, in your experience in the federal government, do you feel like they also need to do more work where that's concerned? Because you
Oh
specifically mentioned businesses and companies, but I'm just curious if that's also a thing that
yeah.
you noticed in the government.
And thank you for catching that because I should have added governments because I'm going to be straightforward with you. Some of the biggest violators is the governments, and when I talk about the governments, it's federal, provincial, and municipal, right? And and I want folks to understand. I'm not saying that the people working in the governments are maliciously thinking, ha ha ha, we're going to make sure people with disabilities don't have access. It's just they've been doing the same thing day in and day out for decades without realizing that what they're doing is not appealing to a certain percentage of people with disabilities. But, and here's where I'm going to throw something at you, right? And the number is 27%. Prior to the ACA coming out, a lot of us working in this field knew that there was a larger group of people with disabilities that existed in this country.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden, the ACA came out. Statistics Canada went out and did a much more refined look at the Canadian population situation and disabilities. And when you include mental health issues, 27% of Canadians self identify as having a disability.
Yeah. Wow. I never. Yeah, it's much bigger than what I ever would have expected, to be perfectly honest.
It is.
Yeah.
And from a guy who's been, to be honest with you, fighting,
Hmm.
in the corner for the community, I've been fighting, with 4%, 5%. All of a sudden, 27% comes out, and I feel like Tyson now. I feel like Mike Tyson now because I'm like, you can't ignore 27%.
No, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You can ignore 3%, 4%, but 27%?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. Yeah. Wow. Um, I guess as a follow-up question to what the baseline Accessible Canada Act is, you mentioned specifically in the book the seven pillars, right? And I think this is a good way of considering what exactly the Accessible Canada Act aims to focus on, right? Because I think people, when they think of accessibility, they tend to think of things like wheelchair accessibility, for example, right? Needing to get up the steps, right? But it goes a lot deeper than that. And I think the seven pillars really do a good job of pointing that out. I don't know if you wanted to list them or I could, but I
Yeah,
think that, yeah.
and so I'll give it a little bit again. If I'm
Hmm.
being too educational, just let me know. The
Sure.
problem is that when the charter is saying thou shalt not discriminate because of disability, what ended up happening in the 80s and 90s is everybody thought about dudes like me in wheelchairs, right? Like and at that time there was something happening in the United States. And trust me when I say we as Canadians, as much as we love to think that we are Canadians and we make our own decisions, what happens to the South largely influences what happens here. And so something called the Americans with Disability Act came into force in 1993. And basically, it forced the whole American industry to make sure it was fully accessible, physically accessible, right? So all of a sudden, I'm a big, huge baseball fan. And all of a sudden, I can go to every baseball game in the States because if they did, I could sue them. And and so all of a sudden, everything became physically accessible.
Mm.
And the same thing happened here in Canada. A lot of locations, a lot of places became physically accessible. So a percentage of people with disabilities, namely me, was able to get access to a lot more locations, a lot more things. But it didn't include the deaf community. It didn't include the blind community. It didn't, the neurodiverse. I could go on and on and on how many disabilities were ignored. And that's why the ACA is also important because the ACA also goes, yeah, guys in wheelchairs are cool. And yeah, they seem to be the symbol for the community, but it doesn't stop there, right? You need to have bilingual sign language in certain places. You need to have hearing interpreter. Like, the list goes on and on and
Hmm.
on.
Hmm.
And think about it this way, right? You go into any apartment building complex and ask yourself, can you go in there, close your eyes, and say, I want to go to the 19th floor and figure out which one's the 19th floor because there's Braille on it? I would say about half of the buildings in this country have Braille on it. There's no need why they all should not have Braille,
Right.
right? Here's another really great example that people don't know what's happened around them. Remember doorknobs?
Sure.
Remember the round doorknobs we all grew up with,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And where do you find round doorknobs now? and only old structures.
In my apartment. Yeah.
Pretty much. Okay, sorry to hear at your apartment, but they're now you can't buy round doorknobs because actually, if you want to buy a round doorknob, I bet you can buy it, but you're paying $20 higher than the next one, which is a line like one where you can put your hand
Yeah.
and slide down. That, my friend, is an accessible change.
Right. Right.
If you get where
Interesting.
I'm coming from, right?
Yeah, because it becomes easier, of course.
And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
easier for you to open the door.
Yeah.
But you see where I'm going with this one, right? And so that's the importance on an accessibility front.
Yeah. Absolutely. And this is a question I have, but I feel like you've already started to answer it a little bit. Um, when people use the term barrier to accessibility, right? These are the things that don't come to mind, right? Are doorknobs or braille, as you mentioned, elevator, right? Most people, right? Listeners who may not know, I do not have a disability, right? I live life as normally as I possibly could, with the exception of poor vision. Um, but these are the things that I don't necessarily consider in my day-to-day life, right? But yeah, I think that way of explaining it that you just did really extends the definition of what a barrier could be, right? And I think that's a really useful way of framing this whole discussion.
Right. I'm gonna use another analogy to make life
Sure,
really simple.
sure.
A barrier is not I go to a Baskin and Robbins or an ice cream parlor and they don't have the flavor I like. That's not a barrier, if that makes any sense, right? Or you go in there and they do not have a selection of ice cream that doesn't meet your stomach issues, right? No, because you chose to go to that Baskin and Robbins.
Right.
In today's world, you can research what ice cream places have that and go there,
Mm,
right? What a barrier is in my mind is something that stops me from carrying out a livelihood or a way to continue my way of living. So, for example, um, housing is a big thing in this country right now, right? Remember, I used that number 27%, right? I'm going to be start advocating, and I'm starting to advocate that, you know, 30% of all our new housing should be fully accessible,
I think
right?
that's a very worthwhile. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And that's a barrier because think about 20 years from now when all this new housing has been built, people with disabilities are going to show up 20 years from now and they're going to say, oh, you're only offering me a place that because, that's not accessible.
Hmm.
That's a barrier, my friend,
Absolutely. Yeah.
right? A barrier is something that you cannot do anything about. So you need technically somebody in a legal framework to come back and change it, right?
Absolutely.
And I want to be very careful here. Barrier is not a choice. If you get where I'm coming from. In today's world where we have information at our fingertips, you can research where to go to get what you want to avoid a barrier. If I'm making any sense,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, for sure.
Right? But what happened to me at the restaurant, some would consider it a barrier. What I consider that is ignorance.
Hmm. Yes. Yes. I think that's a really good
If you
distinction.
get where I'm
Yeah.
coming from, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Because the restaurant absolutely could have put into place a wheelchair accessible entry, for example. And they chose not to. It was an active decision at that point. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. The housing one is a really good example. I really enjoy that one, or I appreciate it, I should say. Just thinking about my area of Montreal, for example, um, I can think of exactly one apartment complex in my area, in the largest possible sense of area, that maybe is accessible, right? One. And that's thousands, maybe hundreds of homes, right? It's, I think it's a really salient example in this case that is very worthwhile. Yeah, very good.
Right. And here's the thing, Patrick.
Hmm.
Today, if somebody goes to the municipality of Montreal,
Yeah.
gets the authorization to build a housing complex, right?
Mhm.
As of today, I believe all signed municipal work should have the 30% rule of accessibility in it.
100%.
So
Yeah.
if the people who are constructing this cannot demonstrate that 30% of that structure is going to be accessible, and especially the main entrance and the parking,
Hmm.
then it should not be signed off. And the problem is that you as a Montrealer,
Hmm.
me as a Canadian who lives in Ottawa, should be demanding that that's what we expect our government to be signing off on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Government should not be signing off on what color the paint is going to be in the damn apartment, but they should be making sure that certain basic minimums are met. Like they make sure there's a toilet in there, running water, and it's not going to burn if you light a cigarette. So the accessibility becomes another element that a municipality goes, you need to show
Yeah.
and demonstrate that you're meeting this because our society moving forward needs to see this.
Yes. I agree. And I'm making this, I'm saying this knowing that it's an argument I don't fully buy, but the counter argument that I see people making for things like this is that, well, it's just going to make the whole housing crisis even more bureaucratic, for example, right? There's more red tape that people are going to have to get through in order to build homes that are, as some people say, like, right, desperately needed, right? And again, I don't fully buy that argument, but I'm curious how you would respond to something like that.
You see, I would respond to that by basically saying all you need to do to get around the bureaucracy is say, I'm working with the Rick Hansen Foundation. I'm
Mm.
working with the Max Bros. I'm working with the Mayans. I'm working with these people, and they've looked at our plans and they signed off on a plan saying we're meeting this 30%. Like
Hmm.
there's so many ways they can get around this and do this and realize that it's just yes, it's an extra step,
Sure.
but at the end of the day, right? Isn't that what governments are for? I know I'm being a little facetious here,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah. But
the governments are to ensure that when you buy a house down the road, you're not buying a house that is a tinderbox
mhm.
without you knowing,
Yeah.
right? Like there's certain, and I hate using this word, assumptions
Hmm.
that we need in our society that we hope that the governments ensure that it's safe for us.
Right. Absolutely. Good. Um, Thank you for that answer. And it was an impromptu one question, but I was just curious.
No problem.
Um, um, so to come back to the ACA, what and to a previous answer that you gave at the start of our discussion, the ACA is rather unique, right? In that it was built, of course, by people with disabilities and for people with disabilities. And I'm curious, based on your experience both as a private consultant uh, and a public service worker, right? Why do you think other policies have often failed to include the lived experience that you mentioned earlier, right? As centrally as it should, right? Like why do people not go that extra step? Because it seems like such an obvious or necessary element, right? And what stops people from actually doing that step, in your opinion?
Well, it goes back to what you were saying earlier.
Yeah.
The number one reason is let's face it, um, we don't have an infinite amount of money, and money has to be spent in. If you're building a building complex, the person who's or the company that's building it wants to walk away with some pocket money, and we want them to walk it away for pocket money because if they don't, then why build, right? Like you got to have a profit factor, and that's something I really understood when I learned from the business side. If
Yeah.
you don't help organizations make profits,
Hmm.
then they'll never get in the damn venture in the first place.
Yeah.
There needs to be, a benefit to the risk, if that makes any sense,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have to, as a community, ensure that people with disabilities don't understand this equation. So we work with businesses so they make money and we get what we want in the end, which is a bigger doorway, of this, of that, and help them make money doing it at the same time. That's a very interesting proposition to do. And the reason why the ACA, in my opinion, exists is because it forces that discussion.
Right.
If you don't force that discussion, then they're going to continue building the way they build, which we know hasn't been meeting the normal standards.
Right. Right. I think that's really good, and it ties into another question that I had, and which was that you mentioned in your book that the ACA is kind of both the carrot and the stick, right? You use that terminology for a bit. So do you mind elaborate? I think this is a good place on elaborating like how you actually balance encouragement and enforcement in right this environment that, as the many examples that you gave indicate, right, still kind of resists full inclusion, right? How does it become the stick or the carrot in this metaphor? Right.
Yeah. So let's use a bank, any Canadian bank. So the bank makes money by you holding all of your business interest, like your personal and business interests, all your money interactions through that bank, right? So that bank now you're a bank, you're a brand new bank, and I've seen this happen with a few banks that I've been working with that are more on the credit union side, right? They're competing with the big ones, right? And so they want to steal your clientele. And the way that credit unions have been stealing people is by personalizing the service a little bit more, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah. Mm.
But we want all the banks to look at people with disabilities as here's a component that can make extra money for you. So there's several ways to do this, right? The first thing is you need to make the banking experience accessible. So
Right.
what's your banking experience? It's the teller and the computer, right?
Yeah.
So and oh, I forgot the last one, the bank machine.
Yeah, the ATM.
So
Mhm.
so the thing is to make the teller easy, well, it's really easy. You just drop the counter. And then for the deaf community, you buy into a service that um, and which now exists where somebody can sign
Mhm.
to you and then verbally speak to the person.
Yeah.
That exists now. Um, and then of course the counter lower. But when it comes to other things, right, like the computer stuff, you want to make sure the blind community and the people that have technology issues can use the internet to do it. And the sad thing is, our banks are becoming more and more less of physical imprint and more of a computer imprint, right?
Right.
And then the third thing is make sure those machines that they now want us to use are fully accessible,
Mhm.
right? And so as a bank, you need to go, how do we help? And like, how do you ensure as a bank we get some new people? So, but when we designed the ACA, we didn't design the ACA like for one big bank to run all of the disability stuff. We were hoping one would go, we'll deal with the blind community. So we're going to just hyper focus on everything on blind. The next one will go, we're going to deal on another form of the community and we're just going to focus. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing some of the credit unions going, you know what? We really got a handle on this neurodiverse kind of stuff. And we're just going to go in that area. We have some that are just coming up with some really gnarly programs for blind people,
That's
right?
awesome.
And that's really freaking awesome,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And 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 that's what I want, like, because you want the blind people to go, Mom, man, I'm gonna go to the bank that takes care of blind people.
Yeah.
That's this. I'm gonna go to the bank that takes care of this people. I'm gonna go there. You see
Mhm.
where I'm going with,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, what we want the act to do for in banks is to treat people with disabilities as a customer.
Yeah.
Where it
Exactly.
really comes down to it, that's the key element of this.
Absolutely. Right.
And that's, I guess, what we're trying to do,
Hmm.
right? Now, of course, the banking industry, and to give the bank their story, the bank said, well, look, Max, we can't turn around and change our machines every 6 months when you guys decide there's a new rule,
Right.
because it takes us 5 years from inception to when this
Yeah.
kiosk machine shows up.
Exactly.
We said, fine, we'll give you 5 years.
Hmm.
Every 5 years, when you put in your new stuff, it better be to the top of the accessibility of the time when that was designed.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fair equation,
Hmm.
right?
Absolutely. It
And
puts
that goes back,
pressure, but still, yeah.
yeah. So this is where the community has to take a little bit of acceptance that things like technology, things like infrastructure are not going to happen overnight,
Right.
right?
Absolutely. Especially infrastructure. I think that's absolutely legitimate, I guess would be a way of framing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, you mentioned in passing, right, the way that the ACA is built. And I want to grab onto that term because you dedicate a whole chapter to what you call the Lego sessions. And I think that's one of the really greatest things in the book. It's not just because I like Legos, but because it's an interesting idea. And would you mind elaborating a little bit as to what the Lego sessions were and why you actually took that approach with building the Accessible Canada Act through those means, if
Yeah.
that makes
And
sense? Yeah.
I gotta be straightforward with you, Patrick. It was probably, and I say it in the book, it
Hmm.
was probably the scariest moment of my career.
Yeah.
Um, and as well, um, it was a Hail Mary. I'm going to be honest, everybody. Like, there's a lot of people who do Hail Marys, don't doesn't work out, and you go, shit, where do I go from here? I wheeled into this, right, going Legos. I'm like you, I love Legos, right? But I'm like, I'm in a glass room where everybody in the public outside can see, 100 and some odd federal public servants playing with Legos. Man, my career is over. My career is done,
Yeah.
right? And it was a moment of brilliance. Um, and it wasn't because of me, and I made the decision to play with Legos. It was the people in the room, what they did, and how the information started popping out by using a kid's toy made me realize that sometimes you got to go down to the basics in order to find a way out. I know it sounds bizarre, but that's
No,
been a
I
big
see that. Yeah.
philosophy of mine since.
Yeah. 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 For sure. Just kind of take it down to its bare minimum. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and I got to tell you, I had a handful of people who were really skeptical on top of it. They were like,
Yeah.
"You serious? You want me to play with Legos, Max? Just trust me. Work with it." Those same people at the end of the session came up to me and said, that was the most effective, most input that I've ever put in any government policy discussion process ever. And I'm not talking about low level government people to hear.
Hmm.
I'm talking deputy ministers, ADMs, assistant deputy ministers, directors telling me that this concept,
Hmm.
playing with this, really brought out the best and innovative thinking for this situation.
Right. Absolutely. And it really ties into something else. And this was another question that I had after of, at least conceptually, right? The act as what you call a living document, right? Of this thing as something that's built and rebuilt continuously, right? Like you would with Legos. And I'm curious how you see that actually functioning in practice, right? Because we tend to imagine, especially certain kinds of acts, we tend to kind of reify them a little bit to use that term. I don't know if it's quite the right term, but we say like, well, once the act is done, you can't really touch it, right?
Yeah.
But how do you see a living document, as you call it, working in practice, right? What does that mean tangibly?
Well, I got to do a little bit of an education on how technically an act works, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when an act is designed to achieve a particular goal, right? So I'm going to use a fictitious goal. We're going to change all our grass blue, right? So as of 2 years from now, on let's say June the 1st in 2027, we're going to make sure all our grass is blue. Well, you look outside there and you go, well, right now my grass is dead because we got no water, but it's brown, but it's green. You want me to turn my grass blue? Yeah, because blue is the better way of whatever methodology stupidity would we put up behind it. But you got to give people time to get the grass blue. If you get where I'm coming from, right? So how do you do that? Well, the policy says grass must be blue on 2027, June the 1st. It's in regulations.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people forget acts have regulations.
Right.
And so it's in the regulations that it's a living document. So remember you mentioned there's 7 parts to this,
Yes.
7 pillars. Well, in order to get those 7 pillars done, you need to have regulatory pushes for all 7 of those points. And that's what I mean it's a living document. So I'll give you an example of what's happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
So the big example right now is that all ongoing communications with the public and internal in the federal government as of next June, not this June, next June, need to be fully accessible.
Right.
So that means every federal public servant now needs to do 2 things now. They need to make sure their emails are bilingual, which we're all used to. And guess what? Accessible. So I call it trilingual. I call it the Canadian trilingualism,
That's
right?
good.
Which is bilingual and accessible. And it means the French version needs to be accessible just like the English version,
So it's
right?
almost quadrilingual.
Yeah, it's a quadrilingual society. And I'm going to be pushing that after next June. The following June, all internal communication mechanisms need to be fully capable of providing services to the federal public servants who write this stuff, who do use this stuff to make sure they got the most efficient technology in order to do so. Does that make sense? Because
Absolutely.
because at the end of the day, right, and it becomes really simple, is that the reason why the regulation exists is because we now know that all the products in which federal public servants use have an accessibility button. Not a lot of them know it exists, but there will by this fall coming. I'm telling you, they're going to know it exists. So
Right.
that means as much they're going to start hating accessibility as they hate bilingualism because
Mm-hmm.
it's not bilingual, can't go out. Now it's not trilingual, can't go out. And you're going to start hearing that, right?
Absolutely.
And I've said this from time immemorial. That's where the federal government needs to go.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And so it's bioregulation. That's how we're going to stay as a living, moving document. Once that's done, another set of regulations are going to pop up for another factor that needs to be changed.
Sure. And on it goes
And that
for.
goes
Yeah.
until 2040.
Um, I want to grab onto another thing that you said, right? Of certain people don't know that this is coming, right? And I have to admit, right? This is not an act that I've heard a lot about, right? I maybe remember reading a one article about it a while back, right? And I'm wondering, you know, why it would seem that awareness of what I would consider to be a vital act in this case seems to be low, right? Is this just the circles that it's run in, the way it was talked about, or just because it hasn't actually been fully implemented yet? Like, what are your perceptions of something like this?
There is, in my opinion, 2 factors, right? The day, now remember, the I worked on it when it was what they call um, it was called Bill C-81, right? So a lot of us, when federal public servants, work on bills. When it becomes an act, we no longer work on it. Now it's a
Yeah,
regulatory body kind of thing. So when it was a bill, right, it was considered the stepchild to the weed bill. And I kid you not, Patrick, it was side by side. The day that, like, the prime minister said online or on TV, said, "Today I am proud to announce, you know, 5 acts," and the first act he mentioned was the ACA. The last act he answered was the weed bill. Who did all the media talk about? Was the weed bill. All you saw was weed, 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 weed. Not one person talked about, hey, wait a sec, one of the most influential changes that is going to happen to our society is actually the persons with disability one.
that's right.
They all thought it was going to be the weed one. Does anybody care about the weed one now anymore?
No, not at
But
all.
I'm going to tell you, it's the persons with disability that's making the most headway now. And the government is not in the business to promote. And sadly, persons with disabilities do not have a mechanism
Mhm.
to work with the media and whatever to say, what needs to be done for society, because we are jumbled in what you call the equity mix, right? The other thing is, like, I'll give you another great example. And one of the best days for the community was announcing Stephanie Cadeau being the chief accessibility officer. And the day they announced her is the day somebody came on TV and said, "We are now discovering graves of dead Indigenous children across the West." So the day that they planned a big announcement, it was supposed to be a big day, got drowned out, in my opinion, by something a lot more serious. And Patrick, I laugh, but every time this community has, a great message, it gets drowned out by something else.
Yeah, I imagine it gets rather. I don't know if tiring is the right word. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
it is. And I don't think there's a person in our country, if you go and ask them, do you respect people with disabilities, and would you think, I don't think there's a person who's going to say, no, I don't. And whatever. I mean, the first thing they're going to say is how much it's going to hurt me in the pocketbook. But, at the end of the day, if you prove to a restaurant saying, go to some guy, spend $200 building a ramp, and for $200, you might now get over, the next 10 years, $10,000 worth of incoming business. Was the $200 worth it?
exactly. It's easy.
Yeah, right.
One of the things that actually surprised me in in your book was that there was a section dedicated to artificial intelligence, right?
Yeah,
And I'm curious if you could elaborate for listeners on how you see this. I say emerging technology. It's been many years at this point, so I guess you could still qualify it as emerging, right? How do you see this fitting in with accessibility, right? Because it's not, I think, where a lot of people would go to first.
yeah. When I was writing the book, I kept on asking the question: what are the things that are percolating that's going to become a major issue when this book comes out? And AI was and is still is the most important thing that's not in the act. It is now in the act because now it's based on a regulation has put it in, and there's now some regulatory discussions happening around this. But I will be honest with you, AI is an incredibly exciting thing and an incredibly scary thing. And and time again, when I go looking to what's going on in California, where the big, companies that are looking at AI, people with disabilities are getting screwed. And what I mean that, and I'll give you two really quick examples. The University of California went to the computer, an AI, and said, "Can you find a nice story about people with disabilities?" And it came back with zero. And it said, "Why are you saying zeros? Disability is a negative connotation, so therefore it couldn't find." So you had to tell it that disabilities is not a negative connotation. Once it did that, it popped a lot of stories, but it was confused because disability, right? Here's something that's going to really scare you. I'm trying to find the book in my shelf here. I forget his name, but there was an experiment that was done, and the they asked the AI, and this was in Caltech.
Okay.
Can you break into the Pentagon? Oh yeah, right. I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, you bring in accessibility and Pentagon and AI. So what ended up happening is the AI started hitting the Pentagon because it's exercise to go and break into it. And within seconds, it realized, oh shit, we're in trouble. What did the AI do? The AI started using accessibility programs to break into,
Huh.
yeah. So, when you go online and it gives you a bunch of pictures in a box and it says, find the bicycle or find the
Yeah,
wheel,
yeah,
and you
yeah,
got to
yeah.
click on that. AI can't go through that,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So, what did AI do? AI called a company that exists for blind people,
I've heard of this. Yes, now that you're saying, yes, 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 I remember this story. Insane.
right?
Yes, please go on. But yes.
So,
Mm.
it called this company with it's a fake person. It's not saying, I'm a blind person needing help to break into this.
Yeah.
And the only reason why it didn't work, the voice sounded too robotic, and the person on the other end started going, "What the heck is going on?" But think about it this way. I just think it's a matter of days before that voice sounds like you and me,
You already have programs
and they
that work
already have,
shockingly well.
and we'll call up and say, "Hi, my name is Max Brault. I'm a blind person. Here's my profile. Can you help me answer this thing?" That's how close we were. And what I'm trying to say in a very humorous way, AI uses accessibility tools
Yeah.
in order to do
Yes.
its functions. So on one point, it's really scary because it doesn't recognize disability, but at the same point, that's where it goes to first. Like think about it that way. Anyways, my biggest scary point about AI, and I mentioned this with Yunta,
Mhm.
is that our databases that AI is based on doesn't have enough accessibility, lived experience capability to feed an AI to properly service people with disabilities in the AI format,
Sure.
right? And I think that if we recognize this, there'll be enough companies that will start popping up that will serve this problem.
Absolutely.
That's why I brought it up, because we need to start talking about it. We need to start making sure it is part of the thing. I'm starting to go back to the government, the federal government, saying that this is an opportune time for the federal government to get into future building capability by funding university college programs with people with disabilities to get in AI, so that in 10 years, maybe it is a person with a disability that designs the next big software, and it's already built in because the person with disability in the first place.
Especially now, isn't it? I don't know if it's past, if the position exists yet, or it's going to, where there is a minister that's in charge of artificial intelligence now. So it seemed like
Uh,
the perfect opportunity. Yeah.
I think there's a bill out
Yeah.
there.
Okay.
I don't think there is an actual, for lack of terms, a Mandarin that we could go that person's been designated
Yeah.
as that. But I think that within the next decade, it will be the next big minister we will have at, there will be one in the provinces, whatever. There's somebody responsible for the behavior of AI. Because if we don't, we're going to be demanding it. If we're not demanding it, we should be, right?
One of the things that I'm always curious about whether it's recorded or just in general, whenever we talk about pieces of legislation, is how do people do more? Because, and I include myself in this, once there's a piece of legislation, some groups tend to say, well, the work is done, right? And I'm curious what your thoughts are on how there are some ways that people with disabilities, or even what we can broadly call allies, to use that term, can advocate for further rights, right, that are not necessarily thought of in the Accessible Canada Act or its state as a living document, right? I'm curious what your perspective on that is. How do people, um, what for you is a good way of advocating for further rights in this particular question?
Well, that's why I call it the race to the starting line. Okay. Because everything my team and we did with the act to make it what it is was to give the community and businesses the you got to do this or else. So from a business point of view, they got to do this or else, and from the community, they got to do it or else. But they need your help. They need you to step up. They need you to tell them what needs to be done. And that's where there's two really interesting elements of this act. One of the key important elements to this act is that they have to demonstrate. When I mean they, corporations are not a bunch of Trumps sitting in the room saying we know what needs to be done. They need to demonstrate that they talk to people with disabilities, their customers, and their employees to understand what needs to be done. So that's key. The second thing is every 2 years it needs to be updated and put online so that everybody could see what are they doing as their progress is making that happen. And that to me, Patrick, is the two. One exists without the other. Like if you go and talk to your customers but you don't tell what you heard, well then it goes nowhere. So to me that's the really two. It's the hammer and the nail kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
um and so one of the things is why I wrote the book, because I can't be there everywhere, right? And a lot of my fellow advocates can't be in every room anywhere to make sure it happens. So people with disabilities and allies need to identify the issues that matter to them and go and address it, because that's why it's the starting line. Now is the time. You got a piece of legislation that now gives you a voice to be heard. Go be heard.
Absolutely.
You know.
Good. I think that's a really powerful note to kind of start ending this conversation. Um, I always ask people that I interview one question that I don't send them in advance, right? And that question is, what is something that I did not ask today, right? And what is the answer to that question?
Well, I think for the first time in my existence and advocating for people with disabilities, I have seen the atmosphere go from a very open atmosphere to being open to equity groups and differences to now it's under we're under the gun now, where we're for the first time ever we are afraid that we're on the threshold of being erased and all the progress being thrown out. And I'm not just talking people with disabilities. I'm talking indigenous. I'm talking gays and lesbian rights, racial rights. We're all for the first time seeing an atmosphere where we're expecting the ball to drop here,
Yeah.
and we're not we're not comfortable. Like, I got to be honest with you. When I was in Montreal, I was in Toronto, um, for an event, and while I was getting ready for the event, I turned on the TV and I heard, President Trump turning around saying one of the number one reasons why two planes accidents happen is because of midgets.
Yeah.
Midgets. They're not called midgets in the first thing, right? There's an actual term you call them. And then he started going on about how people with disabilities in the airline industry is messing up the airline industry.
Yeah.
I wanted to destroy that TV in the hotel room because it was the first time that I heard a person of that rank blaming a really nasty thing on people with disabilities when I know it's not the case,
Of course not.
right? But it starts creating fear,
Yeah.
right? And if you have fear about hiring people with disabilities to deal with aviation, why would you hire them as a doctor? Why would you hire them in all the other kind of professions that have some kind of,
Yeah.
you make the wrong step and oops, a lot of people die, right? Like, to me,
Completely
that
misses the mark of what accessibility means. Mm-hmm.
exactly, right? And then the funny thing is, 2 weeks before that, I put on my LinkedIn page an article about one of the first Canadians with disabilities who's a paraplegic, so he doesn't have capabilities below his legs, as a surgeon. And you don't need your feet to be a surgeon, dude. If your hands work and your eyes work in your hand, and you can do the job, who cares? So they were talking about how they had to they had to redesign a medical room to suit his capacity. But he produces on the same level and par as any other surgeon.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, if you got something that is killing you and this guy can solve it, do you matter if his feet work or not?
No, of course not. No.
Right?
I just want to
The
live.
same thing with your loved one. Do you care
Yeah.
if his feet work? No. Is he one of the best surgeons on the staff? Yeah. Okay. Give him all the tools to do his job and save my loved one. And that's the point I'm trying to get at, is that I thought we got beyond this,
Yeah.
right? And that's where I'm scared of. I'm 55 years old. Um, I'm starting to see, my sunset years coming, and I didn't think I would be fighting this fight still on this thing. And I think this book will really help people understanding how we can position ourselves in Canada at a much different level of light than our neighbors to the south.
We were a bit delayed in the recording of this episode, but if I remember correctly, the book is already out, right?
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. So I obviously encourage listeners to go buy it, get a copy, check it out. It should be available everywhere. Support your local bookstores, right? Or buy it directly from the publisher. But I strongly encourage people to go out and get it. It is well worth the read, in my opinion. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, you looked like you were going to say
No,
something.
thank you. We're still having a little bit of distribution channels because I've never written a book before, so we're learning.
Yeah,
My partner and I are learning how to get it out.
sure.
But over time, it's going to get easier and easier to find this book. Go to Max Pro SMA Foundation.ca to find the book until you can find it on your local shelves. But hopefully, within the next month, it'll be on your local shelves and everywhere. Um, and I want to hear from people. Like, there's a section in there where people can get back to me because I really believe it's important that I did this book for you guys. I didn't do it for me. I didn't do it for money. I didn't do it for prosperity. I did it because of two reasons. One, I want everybody to know the rights, and I wanted everybody to know that this happened because I think there's a lot of amazing work that happens in the federal government that never gets promoted about. All we hear is the bad news of what one politician or another is talking about, but we don't talk about some of the groundwork thinking that happens in the federal government.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think this is one of them.
Great. I'll be sure to put the link in the show description when it comes out. But yeah, is there anything else you want to plug? Any other projects that you're working on that you wanted to mention? Or
Yeah, keep an ear out for something called For Humanity Canada. For Humanity Canada is the AI company that I and a gentleman by the name of Jim Provo is creating to ensure that that messaging about using this golden opportunity to fund programs to get people with disabilities in the university and college systems the education and knowledge so that they can become our next inventors in AI. Like Canada should be a leader in this. Why not make sure it's every Canadian that's a lead in this, right?
right. Absolutely. Well, Max, thank you so much for your time. It was really a pleasure listening to you talk and truly a pleasure to read your book. And whatever project comes down the road, I really look forward to seeing what's next in this case. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick.